Good evening. This is Community Unity Now, the D Tycoon Show. This is Bill Morton, President of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, and I am Trudy Leong, Administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. Our very, very special guest today is Lisa Lee. She is Executive Director of the National Public Housing Museum. How are you today, Lisa?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Oh, thank you for being here. First of all, what is the mission of the National Public Housing Museum?
I'm so excited to tell you a little bit about the museum. We are a civic institution that is going to be an anchor on the near west side of Chicago. And we've actually been a museum for the last 15 years, but our efforts now are focused on moving into the last remaining building of the Jane Addams Homes, one of our nation's first housing projects, and that will be our new permanent home. And what we do at the museum is call on the power of place and memory, and we explore what we have not yet learned from the history of housing in order to create a more collective and just future for us all around housing issues. And our mission is to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where everyone can live and prosper. And maybe what I want to say, just in addition, is that around 15 years ago, at the sort of height of the plan for transformation, public housing residents noticed all of their buildings coming down. In an effort to address the problems of public housing, Chicago actually dismantled the sort of largest net, sort of amount of affordable and public housing in the entire history of the world and destroyed it. And people were thrown into a diaspora and displaced. And public housing residents said, we actually need to save one last building to create a museum. And this museum should be a site of conscience that links history with contemporary issues and challenges the kind of mainstream narrative around public housing, which allowed for it to be so easy to dismantle people's homes.
In the beginning, was there, for instance, now there is a sort of stigma around public housing. But when public housing started, was there that stigma there?
No, there wasn't. And you're absolutely right, Trudy. For example, when I say the word public housing, for the most part, for a lot of people, it often conjures up a kind of single story, right? And it's a story of crumbling buildings, racialized poverty, gangs, a lack of public safety. But in this single story, there is no way to know the stories of community resilience or collective joy. There's no way of knowing about vibrant networks of friendships like book and bridge clubs or thriving businesses or candy ladies or beauty salons or cooperative gardening, which are all part of the history of public housing in a way. And like in a single story, we can't know the veterans who returned from war, who made a home there, right? We don't know about Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, who funded poetry programs in Cabrini Green. And so there's a kind of way where the museum's job is to challenge a single story about public housing. And like you said, in the beginning, when public housing was first sort of started by the 1937 Housing Act, there was a lot of diversity of different people who lived in public housing. The buildings were absolutely beautiful because there hadn't been decades of deferred maintenance and disinvestment at that time. And, that's not to say that there weren't a kind of racialized history and a history of segregation actually built into public housing from jump. That's the kind of history that Richard Rothstein in The Color of Law talks about, for example. That's always part of our nation because of our nation's history. But truly, in the beginning, there was absolutely no stigma for anyone who lived in public housing. The Depression had happened and people were in the need of housing, and the demand was for our government to really provide for its people, and housing was one of the most urgent things that people needed.
In the beginning, was the public housing all built from scratch, or was it some of the buildings were maybe abandoned buildings or vacant buildings that were also brought into that were turned into public housing?
Or maybe businesses or schools that were converted to public housing.
Yeah, I mean, right from the beginning, when there was the kind of 1937 Housing Act, that was part of also the WPA, the Works Projects Administration effort to provide jobs. It really was mostly spaces that were built because they needed to have construction jobs. They wanted to have people, sort of participating in the economy of building these spaces. And so there was really little effort to rehab, reimagine, and to sort of reuse properties. Now, these days, of course, there's a very vibrant conversation along with people who are pushing, for example, Green New Deal and other efforts to really think about environmental sustainability. And definitely in today's time period, conversations of public housing can't be had without thinking about sort of restoration and repurposing of other buildings.
You mentioned deferred maintenance that downgraded, that just kind of destroyed the public housing stock that we had in the beginning. What caused the deferred maintenance? Because with the WPA, maybe it ended and then people did not need the jobs because maintenance would be jobs for people.
Yeah, that's a hard question, Trudy,
Oh, that's okay.
but there's a kind of easy answer,
Mm.
which has to do with racism in the United States. Like I said, in the beginning, public housing really was very diverse in, for example, not just the cities and urban centers of our nation, but also all throughout in rural communities in rural Pennsylvania or out in Wyoming. I mean, there's public housing was in every single state of our nation, right? There's public housing in Alaska. There's public housing in Hawaii. And so the thing, though, that changed is that one, there was a huge amount of pressure almost immediately, but mounting in the 40s and the 50s from the real estate industry to push the government to actually provide subsidies for people for single home ownership, right? Like that was much more effective for the real estate industry. And this effort of seeing housing as a public good and part of the Commonwealth was really starting to push up against people who were profiteering from housing and wanting to push people into single family homes. Then layer on top of that kind of banking practices, which were deeply racist, the sort of federal mortgage policies, the FHA, and sort of redlining practices that made it increasingly difficult for African Americans and other people of color, but mostly African Americans, to get mortgages and to buy homes in places. So there are, sort of Italian families, Polish families, Jewish families, Irish families who start to move out of public housing, but African Americans sort of can't. And so they stay in these housing projects. Once the demographic starts to change, there's a complete different switch in caring for these buildings, in sort of how they sort of see them. And so that's like the kind of moment where you can really notice a change in our respect for the buildings and also a respect for the people who live in public housing.
And regarding the racism, the story of Englewood with the rent-to-own scams, where when you can buy it for $1 after you rent it for so long, and then they evict them, and then there's a lot of abandoned properties in Englewood.
Yeah.
Could you tell us how that relates?
Yeah, 100%. Well, the National Public Housing Museum is actually working on, I think, a beautiful, capacious project with an artist named Tanika Lewis Johnson right now to explore the history of unjust land sale contracts that you mentioned. This complete nefarious practice of sort of swindling Black families into thinking that they were actually paying true mortgages for homes, but then actually they weren't mortgages at all. And then if you missed one payment, for example, or you were just a day late, you would actually lose all your money and be evicted from your home. And this practice was very prolific in Englewood. There's a really important study done by Duke scholars that was put out. And in Chicago, a wonderful artist named Tanika Lewis Johnson started to she lives in Englewood and she works with community organizations there, and was like, wow, I want to see like all these vacant buildings and all these vacant homes and other places. What is their history? And there's now, if you go drive through Englewood and if you go to our website at nphm.org, you can see these different sites because Tanika put up memorials and monuments in front of these buildings that tell the history of the families who had their homes stole from them. And there's what resulted was what we know now, which is a disproportionate amount of wealth that white families and white people are able to pass down through their legacies of homeownership that doesn't incur in the same sort of percentage with African American families in the United States. And so the disparity in wealth is really, of course, it's links back to the history of slavery in the United States ever since then, but in the 20th century can really be pinpointed to these unlawful, unjust housing policies that existed.
Are these policies still going on now?
Well, there was just a study that came out that looked at, sort of the percentages of mortgages that were given out to Black families by Chase, by, all these big banks. And unfortunately, it was also incredibly disproportionate, the amount of white families that were getting mortgages and things like that. So yeah, no, we're still living in a period of, unfortunately, white supremacy that perpetuates unjust housing practices. But luckily, I think there's a lot of sort of movement and solidarities and people sort of really pushing to understand this history, which is why the museum, I think, is so important. We forget that where we are now is directly related to the past. And there's that famous Faulkner quote where, like, history is not dead. It's not even past, right? It's like living with us right now. And so there is, our job as a museum is really to make sure that people know this history and how relevant it is in order for us to build on it, for people to be accountable, in order for us to make demands for change. And maybe I want to say one thing about that, which is the museum is really unique because we are arts and cultural institution. We preserve objects, we tell stories, we have vibrant public programs. But what's really different about us is we link arts and culture with public policy in order to create social justice for the future. We do this through our theory of change, which is the importance of storytelling. And giving a story is to give an account. And the root of that word, to give an account of something, is linked to moral accountability, like sort of holding people civically accountable for the history of past wrongs. And that's also linked with sort of fiscal responsibility and investments, which is like the keeping of accounts, right? And so we really want to sort of make sure that investments in communities, in neighborhoods, and thinking about policies that really redress and remediate and repair the history of wrongdoing are put into place. And you can't do that. And there's like a really direct line between that history of repair and the importance of storytelling.
So how do you do your oral history?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, we're living in Chicago, which is an incredible city for oral history. Whether you're talking about the history of Studs Terkel or Dr. Timuel Black, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lorraine Hansberry, like these were incredible oral historians, and we really build on the tradition. And also we build off the tradition of storytellers and oral historians, which maybe people haven't heard about, like Miss Beauty Turner, who was a Robert Taylor resident, who led these beautiful bus tours around Chicago's public housing complexes, and then introduced people to public housing residents to learn about the present day conditions of public housing. And she led these things called ghetto bus tours, but the ghetto stood for the greatest history of our people ever told. And there's a way where we want to train the next generation of oral historians to gather these stories. And then we've created the nation's largest archive of public housing histories and stories for not just people to sort of refer to for their families and their ancestors, which are really important, but also for scholars, for media makers, for cultural makers. And we have a wonderful oral history manager named New Chen who's leading this effort. And we have funding from the Mellon Foundation as a community archive. And we also have, we've been training not only people here in Chicago, but all across the country. And the other thing that's really unique about our program is not only do we teach the ethics and the sort of methodology of oral history, but we also train public housing residents and hire them as part of our workforce training program to be oral historians in order for us to expand the stories that our nation tells and preserves. And so the work is both a little bit like we want to build our archive for other people to be able to plumb for use in public policy and for arts and culture, but it also is a call to our nation to have a much more inclusive foundation for the stories that we preserve and tell and interpret.
Is public housing able to address homelessness?
Thanks for asking that question, Trudy. In our world, too often, social movements are balkanized and siloed from one another. Like, we don't think about war and warming, right? And like they're so linked with one another. We need to be thinking about housing in a sort of collective way. And the movements, for example, to address houseless people and to serve them is really different sometimes than the conversations that occur in the gatherings around public housing, which is also really different from people who are talking about affordable housing. And we have to actually blur those boundaries and realize that collectively we need to all be together as one voice, pushing for housing to be a human right and not a commodity. And the other thing that's really important is to make connections between housing, public housing, and public education and public health issues and public safety issues. The work to sort of, end police violence and to find alternative ways of creating safety is very much related to the history of public housing also as well. And I think, sort of the crises of in almost every major urban space of seeing people in underpasses, families of like, I was just at a talk with the CTU and people talking about the number of houseless students that are now in public school, is that we really have to be aware that this is a critical public health crisis that we need to address. It's a human rights crisis. And this is part of the need to build more public housing, to demand that our government is responsible for its people. And over the last 2 or 3 decades, our government has really disinvested itself from not just the building of public housing, because there have been sort of terrible amendments like the Faircloth Amendment, which maybe people have heard of, which actually stopped the US government from building new public housing projects. And that is, sort of being passed through Congress now to sort of get rid of that Faircloth Amendment. But also, the government has sort of disinvested from managing public housing and maintaining public housing, right? And so there's a lot of these issues that are related to the privatization and the profiteering around housing, which need to be addressed and reimagined in order for us to have a more collective and just future.
Do you know if the FHA was actually lobbied by the private sector to manage and acquire public housing for profit?
Yeah, I mean, there were different kinds of lobby groups ever since the beginning of public housing. For example, even in this beautiful moment, when you read the 1937 Housing Act, which has some of the greatest ambitious language, I think, ever about sort of the need for housing as a human right for all people, it was still a concession to Southern white senators who who were against the WPA. And so, for example, baked into it was sort of this Harold Ickes had needed in order to compromise and get this WPA passed, it needed to have something called the neighborhood composition rule, which ensured that any housing complex would reflect the diversity of that neighborhood. So even in the Jane Addams homes, where we will have our permanent building, there were 2 buildings where African Americans were allowed to live, and then the rest of the building needed to be, it was segregated, and there was sort of white people, right? And that was sort of from the lobby efforts of Southern whites who did not want housing to be integrated, did not want the government to be expanding and providing these social services, et cetera. And then the real estate lobby was a really forceful lobby. But if you think about it, like there's construction trades, and like even when you look at early sort of GE, like General Electric ads, right? There is an effort to have single family homes so that everybody will need a stove, everybody will need, like a washing machine and things like that. And in the early 20th century, there were actually a lot of cooperative efforts, like people imagining, why do we all need to have our own kitchen? Why can't we actually share a kitchen, right? Like things like that. There was a lot of different ways of imagining how we would live. And recently, only in 2012, did HUD, our sort of housing authority in the United States, pass something that was a kind of really inclusive, fair housing act. Because even though people talk about 1968 as the Fair Housing Act that guaranteed no discrimination on sort of race, there was, for example, gender and sort of sex were not protected classes in the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And even in the beginning, there was a kind of sense of what we understood a family to be, which was a heteronormative man and a woman with 2 kids, right? And so they didn't imagine families being structured in many different ways. And so even since the beginning, so there was a very deeply like religious lobby also that was pushing also for the government to insist that certain families be defined in certain ways, and to make sure that when people were applying for public housing, that they reflected a kind of respectability politics, right? So that has always been a part of the history as well. But luckily, with the solidarity of social movements, with the LGBTQ and trans movement, like a lot of this stuff has been challenged and passed through. And we really have to reimagine what it means to have a family, what it means to have a home, if we're really going to also reimagine housing in our nation.
What about in the case of returning citizens? How does public house are they allowed to get public housing?
Yes. Now that's something which is so important because in a time when we have been defunding public housing projects and building, we all know that we've actually spent so much money building prisons and housing people in those prisons. So in fact, if you think about the investment in prisons, it's a different kind of public housing that we've invested in, right? And that's something that we need to really challenge and reimagine and understand. And there's, I taught a class in Stateville Prison with Ben Austin, who's a wonderful journalism and a scholar who also has written a wonderful book about Cabrini called High Rise Stories. And this was a class about the history of public housing. And the guys in that class coined this kind of term from the project to prison, right? Because the projects were so heavily surveilled. There was such an effort to criminalize marijuana usage or whatever it may be. And so many people sent to actual prison that most of those guys were living in public housing, in prison, had a background in living in public housing at some point. When you actually are released from prison in, for example, Illinois and the city of Chicago, there are very strict rules. And recently CHA had a pilot project to sort of allow returning citizens to apply for CHA housing. but they did it as a pilot project. And once it was fulfilled, they ended that project. And so that's something that we actually really need to sort of bring back and push. Now, I'm really proud to say that Cook County and the city of Chicago actually passed something called the Just Housing Act, which was to make it illegal to discriminate against people who are formerly incarcerated when you're looking for housing. But unfortunately, there are still pretty strict rules that govern who is allowed to live in public housing. Now, I just want to say one thing, that people are also trying to challenge these rules because they're deeply inequitable. Because right now, even though we are not building necessarily new projects per se, there's a lot of mixed income housing communities, and there's a voucher system in where private entities can actually sign up and their apartments are subsidized by the government. And so you could have a public housing unit, for example, anywhere in the city, which is sort of being managed and run by a private rentor, but that's actually the public housing unit, right? So that's the voucher system that we've sort of inherited in since the 1980s. And it's something that people are also looking at to see if this is actually a real solution or if it has also further privatized public housing. But you could live then in a kind of mixed income community or right next door to somebody where, for example, it's legal to smoke pot in your home right now. But if you're in a housing unit right next door, you're not allowed to smoke pot because it's a federal, like it's not legal federally, right? Or you're allowed to have your own business, right? You could be an architect and you could run your business out of your home. But you're not allowed to actually have a business if you're in a public housing apartment. Now, I do want to say that recently, Marissa Rivera, who is the Commissioner of Housing in Chicago, just this last year, passed a new law that had a very broad and capacious definition of entrepreneurship and changed that for the first time, that you're allowed to actually have a business running out of if you were living in public housing, in an informal business, or like if you're a beauty salon or a barber shop. And that was so important to sort of do that, to adjust equity issues, because you could be living right next door to somebody and have a completely different law govern you than if you were living in housing. And I think that is something that people and advocates are trying to change.
And are they able to change it? Are people able to have businesses now in public housing in some places?
Yeah, well, it depends, not here in the city of Chicago, but all across the country, people are fighting to challenge this. Are you talking about the returning citizens and expanding that, or just in general? One, I believe in people power. I believe that the government is there to sort of serve our interests. And so I do think that there's, ever since, the pandemic in particular, so many people have realized this fierce urgency that we need to address, which is the housing crisis, right? Like 40% of Americans now live in some sort of housing insecurity. And we have to address this, which, it's linked with mental health issues, it's linked with public health issues. And so there's a way where we need to see housing as the preeminent issue of our time, and all of us collectively band together to make sure that there's more public and affordable housing all throughout our city.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa Lee. Could you give our viewers more information about how they could learn about the National Public Housing Museum?
Yes. So please go to our website, which is www.nphm.org. Come to one of our beautiful programs where we bring people together to sing, to dance, to learn together about this history, and look forward to the opening of the museum in our permanent space in around a year. And if you want to find out more about our exhibits that are coming up, which include 3 restored apartments from 3 different generations, if you live in public housing, please donate your story to the archive. And we have beautiful public art that is going to be going into the museum as well, a new work by Amanda Williams and Olalekan Jayafus, a sculpture park that's going into the place. There's just such an expansive, beautiful site. I want to invite you to go to our website and look into it, and also sign up for our newsletter and come to one of our programs.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa Lee, Executive Director of National Public Housing Museum. This is Bill Morton, President of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, and I am Trudy Leong, Administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us on Community Unity Now.